Marcus Chen stepped off the tour bus at Buckingham Palace, his oversized camera hanging around his neck like a badge of honor. The 28-year-old travel blogger from California had spent months planning this trip to London, and today was the day he would capture the perfect content for his social media channels. His followers were expecting something spectacular, something that would go viral and boost his struggling online presence. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Marcus joined the crowd of tourists gathering near the iconic gates. He pulled out his phone and started recording a selfie video, speaking directly to his camera with the practiced enthusiasm of someone desperate for internet fame. "What's up, adventure seekers? Marcus here, and today we're at the most famous palace in the world. But I'm not just here for boring tourist photos. Today I'm going to get closer to those legendary royal guards than anyone has ever dared before." The royal guards stood perfectly still at their posts, their tall black bearskin hats creating an imposing silhouette against the palace walls. Their red tunics were immaculate, their boots polished to perfection, and their faces remained completely expressionless despite the dozens of tourists pointing cameras at them. These were not actors or performers. They were active duty soldiers from elite regiments trained to protect the royal family and maintain the dignity of the crown. Marcus noticed how the other tourists kept a respectful distance, taking photos from behind the rope barriers and speaking in hushed, reverent tones. This annoyed him. He had seen countless travel videos of people posing with the guards from far away, but none of them had the courage to create truly engaging content. His subscriber count had been dropping for months, and he needed something extraordinary to turn things around. He approached the nearest guard, a tall man with piercing blue eyes who stood like a statue beside the palace entrance. The guard's name was Sergeant William Davies, though Marcus would never learn this detail. Sergeant Davies had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and had been protecting the royal family for 2 years. He took his duty seriously and had dealt with countless tourists who failed to show proper respect for the institution he represented. Marcus began his approach slowly, testing the boundaries. He took several photos from increasingly close distances, each step bringing him nearer to the motionless soldier. The other tourists began to notice his bold behavior, some pulling out their phones to record what was happening. A few whispered warnings, suggesting he should maintain a proper distance, but Marcus ignored them completely. "Look at this guy," Marcus said to his camera, zooming in on the guard's face. "He's like a robot. I bet he won't even blink if I get right up close to him." The security cameras positioned around the palace began tracking Marcus's movements as he crossed invisible lines that marked the boundaries of acceptable tourist behavior. Palace security guards in plain clothes, positioned strategically throughout. The crowd started moving closer to monitor the situation. They had protocols for dealing with disruptive visitors, but they preferred to let situations resolve naturally before intervening. Marcus's confidence grew as the guard remained perfectly still. He began narrating his actions like a nature documentary, treating the soldier like an exotic animal in a zoo, rather than a human being performing sacred duty to his country. The crowd around him grew larger, drawn by the spectacle he was creating. "This is incredible content," Marcus muttered to himself, reviewing the footage on his phone. But even as his excitement grew, he failed to notice the subtle tension building in the air around him. The other guards had begun communicating through nearly imperceptible glances and tiny hand signals. Palace security was moving into position, and Sergeant Davies, despite his outward appearance of complete calm, was becoming increasingly aware that this tourist was different from the usual harmless photography enthusiasts. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of protocol, patience, and the very foundations of respect between a desperate content creator and one of Britain's most elite soldiers. Marcus had no idea that his quest for viral fame was about to lead him into a situation far more serious than he could have imagined. The morning progressed and Marcus's behavior became increasingly bold. What started as close-up photography had evolved into something far more problematic. He began making faces at the guard, pulling silly expressions just inches from Sergeant Davies's face, all while his camera rolled continuously. The crowd of onlookers had doubled in size, with some tourists expressing concern, while others seemed entertained by the impromptu show. "Watch this, guys," Marcus announced to his phone camera. "I'm going to see how close I can get before this tin soldier breaks character." Marcus reached into his backpack and pulled out a bag of chips, deliberately crunching them loudly near the guard's ear. The sound echoed off the palace walls, but Sergeant Davies remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead. His training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation, though few tourists had ever pushed the boundaries quite this far. Other visitors began expressing their disapproval more openly. An elderly British gentleman approached Marcus and tapped him on the shoulder. "Excuse me, young man," he said in a crisp accent, "but this behavior is highly inappropriate. These guards are performing their duty to protect our sovereign. They deserve your respect, not your ridicule." Marcus turned around, his camera still recording. "Relax, old man. It's just harmless fun. He's getting paid to stand there and look pretty. I'm not hurting anyone." The elderly gentleman's face reddened with indignation, but before he could respond, Marcus had already turned back to continue his harassment of the guard. He began making exaggerated marching motions, mimicking the guard's posture in a mocking fashion. Several children in the crowd started giggling, not understanding the serious nature of what they were witnessing. A tour guide leading a group of German tourists noticed the commotion and quickly steered her group away from the area. She had worked at the palace for 5 years and had never seen a tourist behave with such blatant disrespect. She discreetly radioed palace security to inform them of the escalating situation. Marcus, emboldened by what he perceived as victory over the motionless soldier, decided to take his stunt to the next level. He began telling his camera about his plan to break the guard, describing it like a challenge or game. His followers' comments were streaming in live, with many encouraging him to push further while others begged him to stop before he got in serious trouble. He started waving his hands directly in front of the guard's face, creating shadows and trying to block his vision. Still, Sergeant Davies remained perfectly composed, though those who knew him well might have noticed the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw muscles. The guard's training included specific protocols for dealing with disruptive individuals, and he was rapidly approaching the threshold where action would be necessary. Marcus pulled out a small mirror from his bag and began reflecting sunlight directly into the guard's eyes. This crossed a critical line. Not only was it disrespectful, but it was now actively interfering with the guard's ability to perform his security duties. The reflected light could potentially blind the guard temporarily, creating a security vulnerability that could not be ignored. At this moment, something changed in the atmosphere around the palace entrance. The other guards, while maintaining their positions, began subtly shifting their weight and adjusting their grips on their weapons. Palace security guards in civilian clothing started moving through the crowd, positioning themselves strategically around Marcus. Sergeant Davies made an almost invisible hand signal to his fellow guards, a simple gesture that communicated volumes about the escalating nature of the threat. In the complex hierarchy of palace security, certain lines existed that, once crossed, triggered immediate and decisive responses. Marcus had no understanding of these invisible boundaries, but he was about to discover them in the most dramatic way possible. The crowd sensed the shift in energy before Marcus did. Conversations grew quieter, and people began stepping back, instinctively, creating a wider circle around the confrontation. Parents pulled their children closer, and several tourists stopped taking photos, sensing that what had begun as harmless entertainment was transforming into something much more serious. Marcus, however, was completely focused on his phone screen, watching his viewer count climb as more people tuned in to witness his reckless behavior. He had become intoxicated by the attention and completely blind to the warning signs surrounding him. His next action would trigger a response that would change his life forever. Marcus decided that simple harassment wasn't enough for the viral content he desperately needed. He noticed a small rope barrier about 10 feet away from where the guard stood, clearly marking the boundary that tourists were not supposed to cross. Without hesitation, he stepped over the rope and moved directly into the restricted area, positioning himself less than 3 feet from Sergeant Davies. The moment Marcus's foot crossed that barrier, everything changed. Palace security guards who had been watching from a distance immediately began moving toward him with purposeful strides. The other royal guards, while maintaining their ceremonial positions, shifted into a state of heightened alertness that was visible to anyone who understood military bearing. "This is it, people," Marcus announced to his camera, his voice filled with reckless excitement. "I'm now in the forbidden zone. Let's see what happens when I really push this guy's buttons." Marcus began reaching toward the guard's uniform, intending to touch the brass buttons on his red tunic for his video. This was the moment when Sergeant Davies had no choice but to act. In one fluid, lightning-fast motion, he stepped forward, brought his rifle to bear, and shouted in a voice that seemed to shake the very stones of the palace courtyard, "Stand back!" The command was delivered with such authority and power that it sent shockwaves through the entire crowd. Marcus jumped backward, nearly dropping his phone, his face instantly draining of color. The transformation of the guard from a seemingly lifeless statue to a formidable soldier was so dramatic that several tourists gasped audibly. But Sergeant Davies wasn't finished. As Marcus tried to recover from his shock, the guard took another step forward, his rifle now held in, a position that made his serious intent unmistakably clear. His voice, trained through years of military service, carried across the courtyard with commanding authority. "Move away from the guard. Move away." The crowd scattered like leaves in a hurricane. Parents grabbed their children and ran. Tourists dropped their cameras. And even the most curious onlookers suddenly found themselves backing away rapidly. Marcus stood frozen in the middle of this chaos, his phone still recording but his hands shaking visibly. Within seconds, palace security guards in plain clothes surrounded Marcus from multiple directions. They moved with the precision of trained professionals, cutting off any possible escape routes while maintaining a formation that ensured public safety. Their leader, a stern-faced woman with 20 years of experience protecting the royal family, approached Marcus directly. "Sir, you need to come with us immediately," she said, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of absolute authority. "You have violated multiple security protocols and are now subject to detention under the Public Order Act." Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as a high-pitched squeak that bore no resemblance to his usual confident tone. Wait, I'm just making a video. This is for my social media channel. I didn't know I couldn't." "You stepped over a clearly marked barrier," the security chief interrupted. "You ignored multiple warnings from other visitors. You deliberately harassed a serving member of Her Majesty's Guard. And you created a security breach in a protected royal residence. Your ignorance of the law is not a defense." The crowd, now watching from a much safer distance, pulled out their phones to record this new development. Marcus's original livestream was still running, broadcasting his humiliation to thousands of viewers worldwide. The comment section exploded with reactions ranging from support to complete condemnation of his behavior. Sergeant Davies slowly returned to his ceremonial position, but his eyes continued tracking Marcus's movements. The other guards maintained their heightened state of alert, ready to respond if the situation escalated further. The professionalism they displayed in returning to their duties while remaining fully prepared for additional threats was a testament to their extensive training. Marcus looked around desperately, hoping to find sympathy from the crowd that had seemed entertained by his antics just minutes earlier. Instead, he found faces filled with disapproval, shock, and embarrassment. An American woman in the crowd was overheard saying to her husband, "I can't believe he's from our country. What an absolute disgrace." The palace security team began escorting Marcus toward a side entrance, where he would be processed according to protocols designed for individuals who threaten royal security. His phone continued recording even as he was led away, capturing his transformation from confident content creator to frightened criminal suspect. As they walked, Marcus could hear the murmur of the crowd behind him, discussing what they had witnessed. Tour guides were already incorporating the incident into their narratives, explaining to their groups why the guards had reacted as they did and what the serious consequences might be for someone who showed such disrespect to the crown's protectors. The magnitude of his mistake was finally beginning to dawn on Marcus, but it was far too late to undo the damage he had caused. Marcus found himself in a sterile interrogation room deep within the palace complex, a place few tourists ever see. The walls were painted institutional white, furnished only with a metal table and 2 chairs. A single security camera mounted in the corner recorded everything that happened in the room. His phone had been confiscated as evidence, still containing the live stream that had captured his entire confrontation with the Royal Guard. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews entered the room carrying a thick folder and wearing an expression that suggested she had dealt with countless similar situations. She had worked palace security for 15 years and had seen every type of disruptive behavior imaginable. But Marcus's case stood out for its brazen disregard for established boundaries and protocols. "Mr. Chen," she began, settling into the chair across from him, "you are in serious trouble. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done today?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Look, I really didn't mean any harm. I was just trying to make a fun video for my followers. I'm a travel blogger. This is what I do for a living. Surely you understand that social media content creation is a legitimate business nowadays." Inspector Matthews opened the folder and spread several documents across the table. "What you've done today constitutes multiple criminal offenses under British law. You've been charged with breaching security at a royal residence, harassment of a military personnel, creating a public disturbance, and interfering with the lawful duties of crown servants. These are not minor infractions, Mr. Chen." The reality of his situation began hitting Marcus like a series of physical blows. Each charge carried potential fines and imprisonment that could destroy not only his travel plans, but his entire future. He had entered the palace grounds that morning as a carefree tourist, and now found himself facing the possibility of a criminal record that would follow him for the rest of his life. "The guard you harassed," Inspector Matthews continued, "is Sergeant William Davies, a decorated veteran who has served his country with distinction in multiple combat zones. He was performing ceremonial duties that are considered sacred traditions of the British military. Your behavior was not only disrespectful but potentially dangerous." Meanwhile, outside the interrogation room, Marcus's live stream had gone viral in the worst possible way. News outlets around the world were picking up the story, with headlines like "American tourist arrested after harassing Royal Guard" and "Influencer's palace stunt goes horribly wrong." His social media accounts were being flooded with comments, most of them expressing outrage at his behavior and embarrassment that he represented their country abroad. His parents in California woke up to dozens of messages from friends and relatives who had seen news reports about their son's arrest. His mother burst into tears when she watched the video of him being led away by security guards, unable to understand how her son could have shown such poor judgment and disrespect. Inspector Matthews slid a newspaper across the table to Marcus. The headline read, "Tourists' Royal Guard Humiliation Sparks International Incident." Below was a large photo of Marcus being escorted away by security, his face a mask of confusion and fear. "Your little video has been viewed over 2 million times in the past 4 hours, she explained. "The comments are overwhelmingly negative. You've become a symbol of tourist disrespect and cultural ignorance. Several British members of Parliament have already called for stricter penalties for individuals who harass the Royal Guard." Marcus stared at the newspaper, his hands trembling slightly. This wasn't the kind of viral fame he had dreamed of achieving. Instead of boosting his career, his desperate stunt had turned him into an international laughingstock and potentially destroyed any future opportunities he might have had in travel blogging. "What happens now?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'll appear before a magistrate tomorrow morning," Inspector Matthews replied. "Given the international attention this case has received, it's likely that the Crown Prosecution Service will pursue the charges aggressively. You're looking at significant fines, possible jail time, and deportation from the United Kingdom." The interrogation room fell silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning system. Marcus sat staring at his hands, finally understanding that his quest for social media fame had led him to a place from which there might be no return. His entire life had changed in the span of a few reckless minutes outside Buckingham Palace. Outside, Sergeant Davies had returned to his post and was performing his duties with the same professional dedication he had shown before the incident. But word of his composed handling of the situation was spreading through military channels, earning him commendation from his superiors and respect from his fellow guards. The contrast between his dignified behavior and Marcus's disgraceful conduct could not have been more stark. The next morning, Marcus stood before Magistrate Elizabeth Thornberry in Westminster Magistrates' Court, wearing the same clothes from the previous day and looking like he hadn't slept at all. The courtroom was packed with journalists, photographers, and members of the public who had come to witness the proceedings. Flashbulbs went off constantly despite the court's photography restrictions, and the bailiff had to restore order multiple times. Magistrate Thornberry, a woman in her 60s with decades of experience handling high-profile cases, reviewed the charges with stern disapproval. She had seen the video footage that morning and was clearly unimpressed by Marcus's behavior. The prosecution presented their case methodically, playing excerpts from Marcus's own live stream as evidence against him. Mr. Chen, the magistrate began, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. You have brought shame not only upon yourself, but upon your country, through your actions at Buckingham Palace. The Royal Guard represents centuries of British tradition and military honor. Your behavior was not merely disrespectful, it was a deliberate assault on the dignity of our national institutions. Marcus's court-appointed attorney, David Richardson, had advised him to plead guilty to all charges in hopes of receiving a lighter sentence. Richardson was a seasoned barrister who had handled numerous tourist-related incidents, but he admitted, privately, that Marcus's case was among the most serious he had encountered. Your Honor, Richardson addressed the court, my client deeply regrets his actions and wishes to express his sincere apologies to the Royal Guard, to the British people, and to his own country for the embarrassment he has caused. He is a young man who made a series of very poor decisions driven by misguided ambitions for social media attention. The magistrate turned her attention directly to Marcus. Mr. Chen, do you have anything to say before I pass sentence? Marcus stood up slowly, his legs feeling weak beneath him. The past 24 hours had been the worst of his life, spent in a holding cell listening to other detainees mock him for his stupidity. He had finally begun to understand the full scope of the damage he had caused. Your Honor, he began, his voice cracking slightly. I want to apologize to Sergeant Davies and all the Royal Guards for my disrespectful behavior. I realize now that I was treating human beings like props for my entertainment, and that was completely wrong. I also want to apologize to the British people for disrespecting your traditions, and to my fellow Americans for representing our country so poorly. His words were broadcast live on several news channels, but public opinion had already solidified against him. Social media was filled with harsh criticism from both sides of the Atlantic. British veterans organizations had issued statements condemning his behavior, while American military families expressed embarrassment that he represented their country. Abroad, Magistrate Thornberry sentenced Marcus to 6 months in prison, suspended for 2 years, meaning he would only serve time if he committed another offense during that period. She also imposed a fine of $5,000 and ordered him to pay additional costs to the court. Most significantly, she banned him from entering any royal property for life and ordered his immediate deportation from the United Kingdom. This sentence reflects the seriousness of your actions, she explained. The Royal Guard performs vital security functions while maintaining traditions that are fundamental to our national identity. Your behavior threatened both their safety and their dignity. You will serve as an example to others who might consider similar acts of disrespect. As Marcus was led from the courtroom, reporters shouted questions at him from the gallery. His attorney pushed through the crowd, trying to shield him from the cameras, but there was no escaping the media attention his actions had generated. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered to witness his departure. Some held signs supporting the Royal Guards, while others simply wanted to see the infamous tourist who had become a symbol of cultural insensitivity. Police barriers held the crowd back as Marcus was escorted to a vehicle that would take him directly to the airport. Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, Sergeant Davies continued his duties with the same professionalism he had always shown. His commanding officers had commended him for his restraint and appropriate response to Marcus's provocation. Several news outlets had requested interviews with him, but military protocol prevented him from speaking publicly about the incident. The Palace had issued a brief statement thanking the public for their support of the Royal Guards and reminding visitors that these were active duty soldiers deserving of respect and admiration. Tourist numbers actually increased following the incident, with many visitors making special efforts to show their appreciation for the Guard's service. Marcus's travel blog, once his pride and joy, was now flooded with negative comments and subscription cancellations. Sponsors were terminating contracts, and other content creators were distancing themselves from him to protect their own reputations. The dream career he had worked years to build was crumbling around him as consequences of his 15 minutes of infamy. 6 months after the incident, Marcus sat in his childhood bedroom in suburban California, staring at his laptop screen with tired eyes. The viral video of his confrontation with the Royal Guard continued to generate new viewers daily. But now, it served as a permanent reminder of the worst decision of his life. His social media following had initially spiked due to the notoriety, but the growth was entirely negative, filled with people who wanted to express their disgust for his behavior. His attempts to rebuild his online presence had failed spectacularly. Every new video he posted was flooded with comments referencing the palace incident. Potential sponsors ran background checks that immediately revealed his criminal record and international humiliation. The travel blogging community had essentially blacklisted him, viewing his behavior as damaging to their collective reputation. Marcus had been forced to take a job at a local electronics store, earning minimum wage and dealing with customers, who occasionally recognized him from the news coverage. His manager, aware of his notoriety, kept him working in the back warehouse to avoid any potential disruptions to the business. The contrast between his former dreams of international travel and his current reality was painfully stark. His family relationships had suffered tremendously. His parents, both respected professionals in their community, had endured months of embarrassment as friends and colleagues repeatedly brought up their son's behavior. His younger sister had changed her social media profiles to avoid being associated with him, and several family friends had stopped speaking to them entirely. The psychological impact on Marcus was severe. He had developed anxiety and depression, struggling with the knowledge that millions of people around the world knew him only as the disrespectful tourist who had harassed a royal guard. Sleep came difficultly, often interrupted by nightmares about being surrounded by angry crowds or facing the stern magistrate again. Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, the incident had led to significant changes in security protocols. New barriers were installed to create clearer boundaries for tourists, and additional signage was posted in multiple languages explaining the serious consequences of inappropriate behavior toward the guards. Security training was enhanced to deal with the growing number of social media-motivated incidents. Sergeant Davies had been promoted to Color Sergeant in recognition of his exemplary service, though the promotion was based on his overall military record rather than the single incident with Marcus. He continued his duties with the same dedication he had always shown, but the incident had reinforced his understanding of how important the Royal Guard's role was in maintaining national dignity and tradition. The incident had sparked broader conversations about social media culture and the lengths people would go to for online fame. Universities began including Marcus's case in courses about digital ethics and responsible content creation. His story became a cautionary tale used by parents, teachers, and social media professionals to illustrate the potential consequences of prioritizing viral content over basic human respect. Travel bloggers and content creators around the world had started using Marcus's experience as an example of what not to do when visiting culturally significant sites. Many began including specific segments in their content about respecting local customs and the importance of cultural sensitivity when traveling abroad. A year after the incident, Marcus received an unexpected email from a small nonprofit organization that worked with young people struggling with social media addiction and poor digital decision-making. They offered him an opportunity to speak at schools and community centers about his experience, not to glorify what he had done, but to help others understand the real-world consequences of online behavior. Initially, Marcus was reluctant to revisit the painful experience publicly. However, he eventually realized that sharing his story honestly might be the only way to create something positive from the disaster he had created. His first speaking engagement was at a local high school, where he faced a room full of teenagers who had all seen his viral video. "I stood in front of that guard thinking I was creating entertaining content. Marcus told the students, his voice steady despite the difficulty of the subject. "I never considered that he was a real person with feelings, dignity, and a service record that deserved respect. I treated him like a prop in my performance, and that was fundamentally wrong." The students listened intently as Marcus described the legal consequences, the damage to his family, and the complete destruction of his career dreams. He emphasized that the brief satisfaction of viral attention could never justify the lasting harm caused by disrespectful behavior. Over time, these speaking engagements became Marcus's path toward redemption. He wasn't seeking forgiveness or trying to rebuild his online presence. Instead, he was attempting to prevent others from making the same catastrophic mistakes he had made. Each speech was a reminder of his failure, but it also represented his commitment to learning from that failure and helping others do better. The royal guards continued their duties at Buckingham Palace, maintaining the same standards of excellence and dignity they had upheld for centuries. Marcus's behavior had been an unfortunate disruption, but it had ultimately reinforced the importance of their role and the respect they deserved from visitors worldwide.